My son's new wife introduced me to her rich family. They all laughed at me until her father saw my face. Wait, aren't you my new boss? Please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're hearing my story of revenge. I want to know how far it's gone. For a moment, the room went silent, and I could feel every pair of eyes fix on me, some in shock, some in disbelief, and a few still trying to hide their embarrassment. You know that feeling when everyone who underestimated you suddenly realizes how wrong they were? That rush of quiet satisfaction, the secret smile you can't quite hide? That was me, right there. But let me back up a little, so you can understand why this moment was 15 years in the making. 15 years of quiet, deliberate invisibility. 15 years of watching the world move around me while I quietly built a life they would never expect. I wasn't always invisible. I used to be just like them, naive, trusting, and unaware of the kind of betrayal that would change the course of my life. My husband, Thomas, had been a brilliant inventor, the kind of person who could see the future in machines. When he passed, the world thought I would fade into nothing, a widow with nothing but memories and a modest savings. But Thomas had left me more than memories. He left me a key to everything, a patent sale that had made us millions, investments that multiplied quietly, and a fortune that could remain invisible to those who were too arrogant or too distracted to notice. I kept it hidden because I didn't want the world to interfere, and because I knew the kind of people my son would eventually meet. I wanted him to build his life without my shadow looming over him, without anyone suspecting that the quiet widow was secretly untouchable. So I dressed modestly, laughed politely when people made small jokes at my expense, and carried myself with just enough humility to avoid suspicion. And yet, every insult, every whispered comment, every sneer, I stored them all away, like evidence, carefully cataloged for a future moment when the scales would finally tip. You might be wondering, what would you do if the people who looked down on you suddenly realized you were the one holding all the power? That's exactly what happened that day, in that gilded dining room when her father's eyes widened in shock. I didn't rush to explain or defend myself. No, I let the moment linger. Their laughter had frozen into silence, and the awkward tension was almost delicious. You ever notice how a room can change in a single second? One look, one revelation, and suddenly everything you thought you knew about the people around you feels fragile and unreal. Her father stepped closer, still in disbelief. I didn't recognize you. I mean, you're the one who... He faltered, unable to finish the sentence. I let him squirm. I let everyone squirm, because 15 years of humiliation, of being underestimated, deserved this. Just this small taste of recognition, shock, and confusion. And trust me, this was only the beginning. Jessica's father wasn't the only one who froze that night. His wife's fake smile twitched as she glanced between him and me, trying to piece together what had just happened. Their daughter, my son's brand new bride, Jessica, looked confused at first, then annoyed. She didn't understand what was happening. She just knew that somehow the attention had shifted away from her. You could practically feel the discomfort in the air. The same people who had laughed at my simple dress, my worn purse, and my plain hair were now trying to look respectful. Too late. The damage was already done. I'd spent years mastering the art of being underestimated, but in that moment, I realized how cruelly some people could use appearances as a weapon. Jessica had always been polite to my face, in that overly sweet, condescending way rich young women sometimes talk to people they think are beneath them. But behind closed doors, I'd heard the comments. My son Dylan tried to hide them, but whispers travel. She'd mocked my house, called it quaint, laughed about my old car, and once, I overheard her calling me a burden he'd soon have to manage. I never said a word. Because, you see, silence can be its own form of power when you know what's coming. Her father, Robert Reynolds, was the picture of embarrassment. You could see it all over his face. His company, Reynolds Holdings, had been a sinking ship 3 years earlier. What no one knew was that I'd quietly bought it through a shell corporation. I'd saved it, restructured it, and made him CEO again. Mostly out of pity, partly out of strategy. It was a move to protect my investments and, if I'm being honest, to watch how men like him act when they think they're untouchable. And now, standing there in his mansion, surrounded by the chandeliers and silverware he thought defined him, I could see the realization dawning on him that everything he owned, everything he bragged about, was under my control.
He cleared his throat, trying to recover. Well, Emily, I didn't expect to see you here. You could have told me your son was marrying my daughter. I smiled politely. I thought it would be more educational for everyone to meet me the way they expected to. The table went quiet again. Jessica shot me a sharp glare, her lips pressed tight. I could feel her pride bruising in real time. She'd spent months bragging about marrying into wealth, about being part of an old money family, and now, in front of everyone, she looked small. Dinner that night was painfully awkward. They tried to act normal, but you can't unsee what's already been revealed. Robert kept glancing at me like he was seeing a ghost. His wife, Patricia, forced laughter at every small comment, her voice brittle and shaky. Jessica's brother made a snide joke about unexpected promotions, which Robert quickly shut down with a glare. And Dylan, my sweet, naive Dylan. He was proud of me, I could tell, but confused too. He didn't know the extent of my fortune, and that was intentional. I'd wanted him to grow into his own man without feeling like his mother's fortune defined him. But that night, watching his new family fumble through polite panic, I saw something shift in his eyes, like he was realizing for the first time who his mother really was. Later that evening, when most of the guests had left, Jessica cornered me near the staircase. Her smile was tight, her voice sugar-coated but trembling underneath. She said, "You know, Mrs. Turner, you really could have dressed up a bit. First impressions matter, you know." I just looked at her for a long moment before replying softly, "You're right, but I've learned something over the years. First impressions fade, but truth doesn't." She blinked, unsure what to say, and I walked away before she could find a comeback. It was small, but it was a start. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't the first time people like them had looked down on me. I'd spent years surrounded by arrogance, greed, and betrayal, but I'd also spent those years learning how to navigate power quietly, how to make my moves in silence until the moment was perfect. That night, as I drove home, I didn't feel angry. I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes when you realize you finally have the upper hand. And though I didn't know it yet, that dinner was just the first spark. Because what came next would expose not just their hypocrisy, but the rotten core hiding beneath their polished lives. Because when people show you who they are, especially when they think you're powerless, you don't confront them right away. You wait, you learn, and when the time comes, you let the truth do the talking.
In the weeks after the wedding, things changed. The Reynolds family went from smug politeness to uneasy distance. Jessica still played the role of the perfect wife, posting photos of brunches, charity events, and beach vacations, all carefully curated for appearances. But behind the scenes, she'd become restless. You could see it in her eyes whenever I visited Dylan. The polite mask was slipping, and curiosity had turned to envy. She couldn't stand not knowing how I'd done it, how a woman like me, who dressed modestly and lived quietly, could somehow control her father's entire company. I could feel her resentment growing every time my name was mentioned. Dylan tried to ignore it, but tension has a way of seeping through even the happiest homes. One evening, I was at their house for dinner when Jessica's patience finally cracked. She'd been drinking, her cheeks flushed, her words sharper than usual. "So, Emily, you must have a really good financial advisor. I mean, managing that kind of money must be difficult, right?" The room went quiet. Dylan shot her a warning look, but she ignored it. I smiled gently, pretending not to notice the challenge hidden in her tone. "It's not difficult when you value patience. The hardest part is learning not to prove anything to anyone." She laughed, a brittle little sound. "Oh, of course, you're so humble." The sarcasm in her voice was thick as taste. I didn't respond. Silence again was my weapon, and I could tell she hated that more than anything, that I wouldn't give her the reaction she wanted. But I also knew that look in her eyes. I'd seen it before in people who confused wealth with worth. Jessica couldn't stand not being the center of control. She had to know more. And when curiosity mixes with pride, it always leads to destruction. Within a month, she'd started digging. She hired a private investigator, one who had no idea that I'd built entire companies through layers of protection. She opened new credit lines to fund the investigation, lied to Dylan about where the money was going, and even started calling people in finance to casually ask about my holdings. I heard about it, of course. My financial advisor, Mark, called me one afternoon. "Emily, I'm getting inquiries about your accounts. Third-party requests, all denied, of course. You might want to keep an eye on your daughter-in-law. She's stirring up the kind of trouble that draws attention." I thanked him and told him to let her run herself in circles. Because here's the thing, people like Jessica always think they're smarter than they are. They chase what they don't understand until they trip over their own ambition.
Dylan, meanwhile, started noticing the changes too. Late-night phone calls, tension during meals, and the growing coldness in her voice whenever I was around. He once confided in me, "Mom, I think Jessica's different lately. She's obsessed with control. Everything's about image." I just smiled and said, "People show who they are when they think no one's watching." He looked confused, but I didn't explain further. Some lessons can't be told. They have to be lived. A few weeks later, word started spreading in the Reynolds social circle. Whispered rumors about the mysterious investor, about Emily Turner's fortune, about how I'd hidden millions for years. Jessica had been bragging behind closed doors, trying to paint herself as the future heir to my wealth. She didn't realize that every story she told only made people more curious about me, not her. And then came the mistake that would cost her everything. She forged my signature. It started small, an attempt to access one of the smaller accounts under a false pretext. She must have thought she was being clever, using an old form she'd found in Dylan's office, trying to move just enough to test the waters. But my system was layered for exactly this kind of betrayal. My attorney called me the next day, his voice calm but serious. "Emily, there's been an attempt to authorize a transfer using your name. The digital signature didn't pass verification.
I closed my eyes, not surprised, only disappointed. I said, "Trace it." He did. The result was undeniable. The IP address led straight back to Jessica's laptop. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by my window, watching the city lights flicker against the dark. There was no anger left in me, just resolve. 15 years of silence had taught me how to wait for the right moment, and that moment was approaching. Because when people like Jessica cross the line from disrespect to deceit, you don't just teach them a lesson. You show them exactly what power looks like when it's been underestimated for too long. And I was ready to remind her and her entire family who they were dealing with.
When I woke the next morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. Not out of spite, but precision. People like Jessica don't respond to confrontation. They respond to humiliation. And I intended to give her both, wrapped in truth. I didn't tell Dylan anything. He was still blinded by love, still clinging to the illusion that his wife was just stressed. I wanted the truth to come from the source, from her own actions, seen through her own undoing. My first call was to Mark, my financial advisor. I said, "I want you to schedule a meeting with the Reynolds Group's board. Tell them it's about the new merger proposal, and make sure Mr. Reynolds brings his daughter-in-law." He hesitated for a second. "You're going to make it public?" I smiled faintly. Not public, just unforgettable. The following week, the boardroom at the Reynolds Tower buzzed with anticipation. It was one of those rooms designed to impress. Glass walls, polished wood, the skyline glinting beyond. I arrived quietly, in a charcoal gray suit, no jewelry, no flash. The real power in any room is the one that doesn't have to announce itself. Jessica walked in late, as usual, clutching a designer bag, her hair perfect. When she saw me seated at the head of the table, beside her father-in-law, her confidence flickered for just a second. But she recovered fast. She said, "Emily, I didn't realize you'd be joining." "Oh," I said softly, "I think it's important for family to be involved when we're discussing future control." That word, control, hung in the air like a match above gasoline. Mr. Reynolds began his usual corporate talk about partnerships and expansion, but halfway through, I raised a hand. "Before we proceed, there's something we need to address." I opened a folder and placed 2 sheets of paper on the table. The room went still. "This is a record of an unauthorized attempt to move funds from one of my private accounts. It was made using my signature, forged from a document that went missing from Dylan's home office. The IP trace led to Jessica's Reynolds device." Her face drained of color. That's ridiculous," she stammered. "There must be some mistake." I slid the second page toward her father. "This is the digital verification report. It's quite thorough." Mr. Reynolds looked at the papers, then at her, and I saw it. The exact moment, his belief in her shattered. The board members shifted in their seats, murmuring, eyes darting between them. Jessica reached for her father-in-law's arm, her voice trembling. "Dad, I would never—" "Enough," he snapped. It wasn't a shout. It was colder than that. The sound of finality. I stood slowly, gathering my papers. I said, "I didn't bring this to embarrass anyone. But integrity isn't something I compromise on, especially not in a family I've invested in." That line hit like a blade, because she knew what I meant. I hadn't just married into their world. Had built it. Quietly. Strategically. And now, I owned a controlling share of the very company she thought gave her power. When I left that meeting, she didn't follow. No one did. 2 days later, the news hit. The Reynolds Group announced a temporary leadership restructuring.
Jessica's father was stepping down for health reasons, but everyone knew what it really meant. The board had voted me in as interim CEO, unanimously. She tried to fight back. She called Dylan crying, insisting it was a setup, that I'd framed her. But digital forensics don't lie, and neither did her spending records, which I had quietly arranged to surface through internal audit. Her image collapsed overnight. The friends who used to laugh beside her now avoided her name. Invitations stopped, calls went unanswered. And Dylan, poor Dylan, he was torn between the woman he thought he loved and the truth staring him in the face. When he finally came to see me, his voice broke. "Mom, did you do this to her?" I looked at him, my son, my only child, and I told him the truth. "No, sweetheart. She did it to herself. I just made sure the right people were watching when she did." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he nodded, slowly. Maybe for the first time, he saw me not just as his mother, but as a woman who had survived, fought, and rebuilt herself in silence. As for Jessica, she left quietly. Rumor was she went to stay with a friend out of state. The last time I saw her was by chance, months later, at a cafe downtown. She looked different, thinner, her confidence replaced by something that almost resembled humility. She saw me, hesitated, then walked over. "You destroyed me," she whispered. I met her gaze. "No, Jessica, I revealed you." And with that, I stood, paid my bill, and left her sitting there in the ruins of her own design. That night, as I stood on my balcony overlooking the city, I finally allowed myself to breathe. Revenge hadn't been about rage. It had been about restoration, reclaiming respect from those who laughed too soon and underestimated too deeply.
And in that quiet, glittering silence, I realized something. The most powerful kind of revenge is simply living so far above the people who once tried to bury you that they can only look up and see their reflection in your shadow. I never told anyone the full story after that. People assumed things. They always do. Some said I plotted the whole downfall for years. Others whispered that I was some kind of genius strategist hiding behind a widow's smile. Maybe they were both right. But I didn't correct anyone. Because the truth is simpler than that. I just stopped allowing people to laugh at me and walk away untouched. Life has a strange way of circling back. The people who humiliate you often end up depending on you when they least expect it. And when that moment comes, it's not about revenge anymore. It's about balance. It's about finally watching justice take shape without ever needing to raise your voice. A few months later, Dylan came to visit. He looked calmer, older somehow, like he'd finally shed the illusion of perfection he once believed in. We sat on the porch, watching the sunset the way we used to when he was little. "I didn't know you were capable of all that, Mom," he said quietly. I smiled. Neither did they. He laughed softly, then sighed. "Jessica called me last week. She apologized, said she finally understood what she did." I nodded. "That's good. Forgiveness doesn't mean you let someone back in. It just means you stop letting them live rent-free in your head." He was silent for a moment and looked at me. "Do you forgive her?" I thought about it. About all the little humiliations, the laughter, the whispers, the nights I cried alone, and the days I smiled through it all. Then I said, "I forgive the version of her that didn't know better, but I'll never forget the one who did." The wind moved through the trees, and for the first time in years, I felt light. Not because I'd won,
but because I'd reclaimed the part of myself I'd buried under their judgment. Later that evening, I stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere down there, Jessica was probably trying to rebuild, and maybe that was okay. We all rebuild after destruction. The only difference is how we rebuild. For me, it wasn't about money or position. It was about dignity, about never letting anyone define my worth again. So, if you're listening to this, wherever you are, and you've been made to feel small, humiliated, or invisible, don't rush to scream your worth. Just build it quietly. Let time speak for you. Because when people finally see who you've become, silence will hit them harder than any words ever could. And before you go, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're hearing my story of revenge. I want to know how far it's gone, and how many of you out there are still waiting for your moment to rise.